It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
Folks, we all know what happened the last couple of weeks. We know what happened with this Jussie Smollett case and how everything just seemed to unravel. And it's got a lot of people very frustrated, what were his motivations? Was it really that he wanted more than $65,000? I know that's the official line and everything. But really and truly, the mentality that goes behind this is really contributing something that is dividing this nation. And it actually makes it, if somebody really does commit a racist act, a hate crime against another person, at this point, everything is suspect because we wonder what the motivations are. We wonder if it's really true. Is it fake news? I want to introduce you to Dr. Will Reilly. He's on the phone with us. He's an African-American professor of political science at Kentucky State University. He's also done extensive research on how the left is selling a fake race war. And Dr. Reilly's book is The Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Dr. Reilly, that book is out today, is it? Is it right?
Yeah, the book releases today.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. Thank you for being on. I really do appreciate it. So talk to us a little bit about, your motivation for writing this book, Hate Crime Hoax.
Sure. Well, first of all, I started writing this book, if you look at how a publication process works, years before the Jussie Smollett story happened. And that's because this isn't a one-off outlier. If you look at the major, widely reported hate crime cases over the past 5 years or so, many, probably most of them, have actually been fakes. So, there's the Jussie Smollett story. Just a week before that, you had the alleged racial incident involving the Covington Catholic boys. I will note yesterday you had another one of these. Well-known LGBT rights activist house burned down. He blamed homophobes. It turned out he set the fire for insurance money, and that's breaking news as we're talking right now. But Yasmin Saweed, who claimed that a group of Trump supporters ripped off her favorite hijab on a train, they shoved her, apparently they threatened sexual assault. Eastern Michigan, the multiple graffiti incidents on these sort of beautiful collegiate buildings. Air Force Academy, where a general had to come speak out against racism. The young black girl who claimed that boorish white men literally peed on her. Kean College, Wisconsin Parkside, Duke Lacrosse, the UVA rape, all those were fakes. And a lot of these were revealed as fakes 2 or 3 years back. So I became interested in this phenomenon of fake hate crime. There are 409 incidents of fake hate crime in the data set for the book. There are more than 150 discussed in the book. And that's an astonishing rate of false report when you consider that there are less than 7,000 actual reported felony hate crimes per year, according to the FBI, and maybe 1 in 10 of those is widely reported enough to attract my attention to other researchers. So if you're talking about 700 incidents a year, and over a period of a couple of years, 500 are fake, the question becomes why. So I set out to figure out why that is, and I ended up writing the book, and I got publication for that with Regnery, which is obviously right-leaning, one of the top presses in the country, and so we're getting it out today. But the question was why this keeps happening.
It really is incredible. We're talking with Dr. Will Reilly. Again, his book out today, Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Now, you mentioned the LGBT activists whose home burned down. Is it, I guess, he burned his own home down? Is that what happened? Or is it a she? I can't remember. I read the story as well, but I can't remember if it's a he or she.
Well, that's actually getting increasingly complex to figure out. I don't want to make jokes, but this is apparently a transgender activist. So this is an F2M transgender person, which means, if I have this correct, that they were female and they became male.
Okay.
So technically, this was a man. If you want to use this language, this is a man burning his home down.
Okay, a man burning his home down. And the reason I wanted to make sure I brought this up, he burned his pets alive. 2 German Shepherds. There were 3 other animals. They were trapped in the house, and then he blamed it on homophobia, and he did it himself. So in your research, Dr. Reilly, what are the motivations? Why stage a hate crime?
Well, first of all, I didn't know he burned 2 German Shepherd dogs alive. Jeez. It's interesting in terms of human motivation that irritates me more than a lot of atrocities against humans that I've heard about in my career as a political scientist. But and perhaps that's because I've never been violently attacked by a dog as versus a human. But at any rate, why do people do this? There are a lot of reasons. I think at the most basic level, most people, criminals in general, aren't misguided geniuses. They're bad people. I mean, the motivations for most serious crime are very basic: money, sex, and so on. And we find the same thing to be true very often with hate crimes. I mean, these are often motivated by insurance money. If you see someone set, a beautiful home on fire with antiques and purebred pets inside it, I mean, very likely that's going to be an insurance case. But I do think there's a second level when it comes to hate crimes. And that is that hate crime hoaxers know that there's a very well-established sort of grievance industry in the United States. And that if one of these incidents is falsified, they're very likely to receive support, emotionally, even financially, from a very predictable set of allies. So, I mean, quite frankly, there are entire sectors of the U.S. economy saying this is a politically centrist black guy. But affirmative action, minority set-asides, the budgets of large civil rights groups like the National Action Network, Black Lives Matter, the Southern Poverty Law Center, that depend on the continuing prevalence of prejudice. And I sometimes say that the demand for bigots right now greatly exceeds the supply. If you look at sports, business, the unions, most of the areas where blacks and whites interact together, there simply isn't a great deal of prejudice on either side. If anything, there's probably more on our side, but not much there. So you need bigotry, you need conflict for certain things to continue, but there's not much. So when there's an incident of this kind of quasi-hate violence, you find that people flock to it. Media outlets that I think can be reasonably described as pretty far left. I mean, MSNBC, CNN, The Root, Sean King, they're going to publicize that story, and they're going to use it to promote this narrative that the old wars are continuing. Yes. So I think that's a secondary motivation. People who fake these incidents know that they're going to get pub, they're going to get a great deal of support.
Again, we're talking with Dr. Will Reilly. He's an African-American professor of political science at Kentucky State University. His book is out today, Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Dr. Reilly, let me ask you this. Why does the left need to believe their opponents are racist?
Well, I think this, to some extent, this gets back to, this isn't conspiratorial, it's just a fact of financial and political realities. The justification for affirmative action, the justification for the large activist groups' budgets, the justification for a whole bunch of things, the claim that we should let in very large numbers of illegal migrants, is that the USA is a racist society. So the left, both political sides in the USA, I like being an American, I think most Americans are good people, both political sides in the USA have had triumphs. I mean, I think you can argue that conservative generals obviously won the Civil War, World War II, Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. What the left uses to counter this argument is, well, we won the civil rights movement. And to some extent that's true. Actually, more Republicans than Democrats voted for the Civil Rights Act. But there's a lot of truth to it. I mean, Martin Luther King wasn't a man of the right. But that is the great leftist argument. We are the people that oppose bigotry in this country. So what you've seen in recent years, because old school racism is gone. I mean, there hasn't been a lynching of anyone of any color for, I think, 25 years. If something like that ever occurred, like Robert Byrd, it would be in a small backwater area and it would be widely condemned. So what you see now is an attempt to redefine these concepts of racism and prejudice. So you hear about these very vague things like white privilege, cultural appropriation. But basically, if your political movement is based on the idea that you fight racism, you need racism to fight.
That's a really good point. That's exactly right. And we as a society, we have to have a victim and an oppressor, and that just seems that people have called this the new Marxism, neo-Marxism, where we're just now dividing each other into as many groups as we possibly can, not just based on race, but all these other factors. Let me ask you this, Dr. Reilly: how does President Trump play into this? Because President Trump on the left, he is constantly pictured as a bigot.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as a Chicagoan, Chicagoans and New Yorkers have a rivalry that's almost as old as dog and wolf. So, I mean, Donald Trump is very much the New York guy. I mean, you can picture him saying something like, "Out of my way, jackass." And I think it's very easy to make someone like that into a devil figure. I mean, Donald Trump is almost certainly not a biological racist. I mean, there was no accusation of that made, whether or not he speaks bluntly, until essentially he started running for office. I mean, prior to that, I'm a big fan of hip-hop music. Donald Trump was shouted out in rap songs. He appeared in some of the videos. I mean, in the song Country Grammar by Nelly, there's the line, Bill Gates, Donald Trump, let me in now, referring to the idea that these are unprejudiced, very rich guys that are going to be welcoming him into sort of the 1%, the upper class. But I think that because of Trump's style, it's been very easy to take things he said out of context and again say, there's really only one argument on the left, which the real left, not union guys that happen to be Democrats, but the left. And that is, you are a racist, sexist, bigot, Nazi, homophobe. And it's very easy to take Trump halfway out of context and make that argument. So I definitely think Trump has polarized things in America, but I don't really think that's Trump's fault. I think Trump will make a statement that's really kind of banal, like both sides in a riot were bad, referring to that horrible incident where you had literal foot soldiers for neo-Nazi groups and the Antifa fighting groups beating the crap out of each other. And that will be taken as Donald Trump defended Nazis because he didn't describe them as worse than Antifa soldiers. And, I mean, to me, it's pretty reasonable to say both of these groups are fairly bad. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't want a neo-Nazi or a black bloc fighter as a next-door neighbor. I mean, those guys just never keep up the lawn. But Trump has been really spun as in a sentence, Trump is the devil figure of the left right now. There's no line that you can have a movement without a God, but not without a devil. Right now, the left coalition is kind of a coalition of the fringes. Because I'm center-right, I'm pretty mainstream politically. You could say that to some extent about the right, too. I mean, what does a genuine Christian preacher have in common with, a hedge fund CEO? But it's much worse on the left, where you have groups that are open enemies of one another, like feminists and transgender people, gays and Muslims, union workers and illegal immigrants that are being unified. And what they're unified by is kind of a dislike of the current American leader class. So Trump, as a businessman from that class that does things like criticize immigration, has been a great unifier for the left. And I think the response to that has been a lot of unity on the right, interestingly enough. I mean, Trump's approval rating, what is it, 48% right now? Mm-hmm. But it's 91% among Republicans. So that means that if you're a core GOP voter, you like Trump, but if you're not, you probably don't. And I think that's really interesting. That's not what you saw with George W. Bush, for example, who was pretty popular broadly, or even Barack Obama.
Yeah. Wow.
So
Go ahead.
One thing, very quickly, I would say here, one of the arguments the left makes, actually, is that Trump is responsible for a huge surge in hate crimes. And that doesn't really seem to be true. I mean, there are only about 7,000 hate crimes in a typical year. So last year there were 7,125 under Mr. Trump, and that's up a little bit. But I mean, in 2014 under Barack Obama, there were 6,518. So any increase in actual violence that we've seen is on the order of 400 cases in a country of 340 million people. And I would suspect that a lot of those cases are actually attacks on Trump supporters. If you just Google MAGA hat fight, you'll see quite a few examples of what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. And matter of fact, there was an Antifa member on a college campus that was punching a Trump supporter the other day. It was removed from YouTube for a time for some reason because it was in this context of the media doesn't cover what they don't want to cover if it doesn't fit their agenda. And real quick, we're talking with Dr. Will Reilly, his book, The Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Real quick, Dr. Reilly, if you can just address the media here. And in my opinion, most of the media, they have a blockade on the truth. I believe they are, in many cases, actively trying to deceive. I believe it is a conscious effort in some cases to deceive the masses, because if they figured out the truth, if they figured out something like we actually have a lot more in common as Americans than we do not in common, that would be bad for their business.
Yeah, I think to some extent that's the final line. I think is the key point. I mean, most media exists as a vehicle for ad sales. And I mean, I'm not saying that from any superior position. I mean, my job before academia, and I enjoyed it just as much, was sales director for one of the large trading concerns in downtown Chicago. So I mean, you have to make money. But by the way, I think talk radio and social media are good routes around this. You can't just lie on 3 TV stations anymore.
Yes.
But yeah, the media obviously has a narrative, and everybody has a narrative. I mean, when I mentioned coming from a sales background or a sports background, one of my narratives, my personal narratives, is you're totally responsible for what happens in your life. And that's not really true. I mean, if I were to get hit by a car in a day when I was out for a run, break my leg, I'd be incapable of functioning in business for months, and that would really bother me because it would challenge my narrative. But one of the media's narratives is standard coastal center-left liberalism. No one really denies that. And that really does shape what media coverage is. So I'll give two quick examples. If you look at police shootings, you can argue about black men being overrepresented and whether that's due to our higher rate of crime or residual but real racism. That's a real conversation. But what you can't deny is that about 80% of the people shot by police are Caucasian, whites, and Hispanics. If you look at media coverage of the issue, though, that almost disappears. So writing Hoax, I actually put my research team on this for a day or two, research assistant, or not 15 of them. But we found out that about 95% of media coverage of police shootings focuses specifically on black victims. All of CNN's coverage did. So you have a situation where 80% of the people that are actually victims of this form of violent conflict are basically poor whites. But that's totally ignored, and that's how a narrative is created. That's how Michael Brown becomes a household name. And this extends to a lot of racial issues, and a lot of class issues, and a lot of feminist issues. So, like interracial crime, first of all, it's really rare. About 90% of murders are committed by someone of your race that you knew, like your ex-wife. But to the extent that interracial crime occurs, it's 80% black on white. Again, if you look at media, which is something we in the black community need to work on. But if you look at media coverage of this, that issue is just completely camouflaged.
Yeah.
Media coverage of interracial violence is again, about 90%, I think you could say, white on black. So the media does, to some extent, and by that I mean the mainstream, televised, print media, does to some extent take stories and spin them however they want. Yeah, I think it's valid.
Yeah. Well, they certainly were very anxious, to report, again, the Jussie Smollett incident. And they know that brings us to this book. Again, Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Dr. Will Reilly, it's been a pleasure, sir, and I really appreciate it. Your book is out today. I hope everyone goes and gets it.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me on.
All righty.